Hi, Robin. Thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie.
So let's get started. I know you've got a lot of members of your family who have ADHD, and you yourself are not formally diagnosed, but you have your suspicions. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I have two kids. Well, I would almost say 2.5 kids with ADHD because one of them, he functions pretty well, but he talks a lot. He actually reminds me a lot of myself as a kid, to be honest. And my husband has it, who I'm not related to, but my mom also has it. So it's everywhere around me. And yeah, I see myself in a lot of these people.
Yeah, and I think also, I have that question too with my whole family, which is like, there's definitely neurodivergencies. And I like how you often address that in a lot of your videos, where it's like, if you're ADHD or neurodivergent or just relate, I sort of feel like we're all on the spectrum. We're all in this area together. So let's kind of backtrack a little and talk about how ADHD entered. Like, were your kids diagnosed first? Were your sons diagnosed first? Or was your husband diagnosed first? Or how did you sort of first come to know ADHD in your family?
Yeah, so my husband was actually diagnosed in the 80s, but the late 80s, and that was not a great time to be diagnosed. So he was medicated, but probably over medicated. He was living with his dad at the time, and so when he came back to live with his mom, she stopped all that. And so he found a career, that was fast paced, that worked well for him. But my kids, the oldest always seemed like a dreamer. He was the type of kid, if you were to walk down the street, he'd be like, oh, stopping and looking at this and looking at that. Time management. I'm not sure if that'll ever be his forte. He's 17 now. He does very well. But it was actually my middle son who really was just that very sensitive person who just coping in the world was a real, real struggle. And he was, thank goodness he was adorable, because when he was a preschooler, he was really hard to be around. And he was the type of kid who I would have to write a note to the teachers every year to be like, this is how he is, and this is what he needs. And sometimes he needs quiet time. And there was a parent teacher interview in grade 2, and all of a sudden the special education coordinators there, and they're saying, oh, he might have ADHD, and maybe you should just give him coffee. And I'm like, okay. And so I'm in Canada, where if you want to see a specialist, you need to be referred and you have to wait. So 9 months later, we get in to see the pediatrician, and the pediatrician was like, yeah, I think he does have ADHD. And so she ended up suggesting potentially medication, other things. And I was reluctant because I didn't know a lot about ADHD. And so we decided to try behavior things, which is hilarious with this kid that we would even bother after trying for so long, for his whole life, basically. But anyway, so about a year later, I'm a nurse. And so I was doing a course about brain health and that. And they basically were explaining how the prefrontal cortex works and how medication helps, bring the function up. Because it's a stimulant. And I thought, oh, well, that makes a lot more sense. So then we tried him on it, titrated up for a month. It was a really emotional month. It was Christmas. But all of a sudden, January came around and we got to know our kid. He could focus. He was incredibly creative. And that was sort of it for him. And then we ended up saying, and I always said, if anybody has it, it's our older kid. So then he was diagnosed. And then, of course, it's like so many parents, you're like, I see a lot of myself in these kids.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know. I just had both of my kids diagnosed this summer, and they could not be more different.
Right.
But it's been through these conversations that I've been having through the podcast and my own journey that I've been able to look at both of their behaviors and really see, a lot of ultimately the executive dysfunction and kind of where it comes from. And even just the concept of executive dysfunction was something I had never knew that term before I myself was diagnosed. So it comes in so many different forms, and it's so interesting to me, how certain kids manage and how certain kids, don't. There's like ebbs and flows, I guess, in our life. Now so you're a nurse and you have 3 boys. So, I mean, when did your kind of journey, your decluttering journey begin, and where did this become something that became more than just a hobby? Or when did this become something that you really wanted to focus on?
It started because I am a nurse and an emergency nurse. And so forever I was sort of like struggling to manage house and home and all the stuff and all the toys and all of this. And once a year I'd be starting to declutter and decluttering kids' toys, which is never the right place to start, I will say. But I would go to the emergency department and it was a very stressful place to work. People are coming in, their lives are forever changed. It was traumatizing to me, traumatizing to the patients. And so I would leave there after 12 hours and come home and want to just relax and connect with my family. But instead I was met with, a messy house. And we weren't hoarder level stuff, but there was always just stuff everywhere. There were always piles. There was always just so much stuff to manage. And I remember around Christmas reading an article. It was about, 4 years now, I think. And it said that women are affected by clutter more. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And it basically said that we can't relax if we feel like there's work to do, in particular, if it's like sitting there staring at us. So we may be not doing something. We may be sitting on the couch kind of paralyzed, but in actuality, we're not relaxing. We're not sort of living our true selves and being able to just take a moment. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I started decluttering and managed to simplify our house down to what I often call reasonable minimalist, which is probably not a great term, but I don't go extreme, but we only keep what we use. So it has made a major impact on my life. And I really wanted to share with people how much it helps. So a year ago, I started coaching people with decluttering and then started doing life coaching for people with ADHD and getting more learning in that and just seeing how it can help people and how just because of how much it has helped me and my family function. My husband, who really honestly had never cared, he loves it. So that's good too.
Yeah, it is something I think a lot of people in the ADHD community talk about, the irony of knowing that a clean, spare environment is incredibly helpful to our focus, our sense of well-being, that calmness that you talk about, and yet at the same time, the inability often to get there.
Yeah.
For myriad reasons.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And sort of knowing, and that's where it's like hiring a cleaning person is something that I think is so important. I'm like, and I will put that ahead of anything else, because not only does the cleaning person do the cleaning, but she helps me, or their team help me stay clean, so it's like twofold. So now you talk about environmental design with decluttering, and what does that term mean exactly? Environmental design.
So environmental design is setting your environment up to support you, because a lot of people don't think of it in that our environment ultimately is there to support us. So I always say, food, water, and shelter. People don't realize shelter. What are you surrounding yourself with? And a huge way of supporting ourselves is our minds in particular. So many of us work at home. And so having less stuff around you, less stuff out, less distraction is so much better for focus if you want to work. If you work out of the home and you're able to minimize clutter around you, it's really good. And so that is supporting you with your environment. But even if you're not working and it's just your living room or your kitchen, the less stuff you have out, the less it is distracting you. So you're designing your environment to support you and to make it easier to do the things you want to do, and putting the things that you use most often in the most accessible places. And if at all possible, behind a door and in a drawer. And sometimes people with ADHD need to leave some things out, and that's okay. So leaving your medication out, very important in a lot of cases. But other times having things tucked away. So that, I think environmental design is absolutely massive in supporting people with ADHD to really succeed and put a lot of the, if at all possible, a lot of the negatives as far away from them as possible, and putting a lot of their strengths closer to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was something that my husband and I really struggled with very early on in our cohabitating relationship, which we've been together 20 years at this point. But like, and I didn't even have an ADHD diagnosis at the time. I didn't really have the language to articulate to him the out of sight, out of mind concept, right? But all I knew was that I needed to have things visible, right? And so I ended up having a lot of piles, or what I used to call organized chaos, which he saw as just clutter. But for me, it was like, no, these are all the things that I need to deal with immediately. And there was a sense of urgency around all of those things. And I was so afraid that if I put them away, I would forget they existed. And that, I think so much of clutter is tied to memory and the disorganization, right? And I think that's something we talk a lot about with it, just like, how do we create structures where we can put things away, but at the same time still have access to them, and and not kind of forget. And I think for me, like my way of dealing with that is having pop-up reminders all the time. So like part of the if I put something away, I have to at the same time put it, say, okay, if this is a form I have to deal with in a week, I set myself a reminder to deal with the form in a week. But that's a lot of work, and it's a lot. That's a lot of bandwidth, and I think we get that can be exhausting. But I think, it's something that idea of out of sight, out of mind is something that a lot of us struggle with clutter. What are some of the, I guess, issues that you find with a lot of your clients, or what are some of the things you deal with that connection between clutter and memory, and that fear of losing track of things?
Yeah, so that is a huge thing. And it's important for the people who are family members of people with ADHD to understand that sometimes things do need to be left out. Some things need to be left out. But put away as much as you can. And this is why it's very beneficial to honestly, if you can do it, own as little as possible. Because the less things you have to manage, the easier it is to manage them. So if you don't have a ton of things shoved in every drawer, and you sort of have zones where you keep certain things in your house, like for example, you have a work zone where you have piles of work paper, and it works for you to have them in a drawer, great. But sometimes that's not going to work. Sometimes we do have to use reminders. I am obsessed with using reminders on the phone, and it is extra work, which is unfortunate. But my 17-year-old came to me a week ago, and he said, "Did you know that that people with ADHD have more trouble waking up in the morning?" And I was like, "Yes." And he's like, "Well, there you go." And I'm like, "So what are you saying then?" I'm like, you still have to function. Unfortunately, there are a lot of drawbacks with ADHD. A lot of people say it's a superpower. I mean, it has a lot of great things to it, but there are a lot of drawbacks. So sometimes we just have to figure out what works for us. And I honestly, the cell phone it's a double-edged sword in a lot of ways, but it has so many good things for people with ADHD because reminders are with you all of the time. And I think using the reminders is absolutely key. Another thing that is really helpful is if you either don't want to use your phone or if you want to use it less, is to have a bullet journal. One bullet journal that you use to write things down, to put down where you keep things. And you could put down where you're hiding presents, where you're hiding chocolate from your husband, which I have to do because otherwise he's going to find it and eat it. And I don't ever get any chocolate because I don't want to eat it all at once. So using some system to remind you, and you have to find what works for you, because what works for you might not work for me. And everybody has different sort of like strengths and areas that, we honestly could just say weakness, because some of them just aren't going to get much better. So we have to figure out what works for us. So for you, you might be the type of person that needs a lot more stuff out, but some people with ADHD, they want nothing out. And when I talk about the neurodivergent people who have autism, a lot of people with autism, they don't want to see anything. They want to know where it is. And they keep very neat, organized drawers. But ultimately, the less stuff you have to organize, the better it is overall for finding things and keeping things put away and classifying things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved my 20s for that reason, because I moved a lot in my 20s. I moved, I went from university until, basically until my husband and I bought this house that we're in now. I moved at least every 2 years for 15 years. And it was great for decluttering. I loved it. It was like this opportunity to purge. It was so cathartic. Both of my parents were hoarders. And so it really, really affected my outlook. I saw how, I've seen how damaging it is. And I think one of the most destructive emotional times in my life was when I had to move them into a nursing home and go through and get rid of all of that stuff, all of their stuff. It was really, really difficult. And it really just it completely transformed my relationship with stuff, and because I saw all of this stuff that had been, they had sort of put emotional value into, and left, and then it was up to me to get rid of it. And so I had to deal with all of that baggage, and it's really hard. And I really, my heart goes out to any adult child of a hoarding parent, because it is really effing awful to have to get rid of that stuff and to deal with how angry it makes that, it's just really, I could go on about that forever. But one thing, it really, really changed my perspective of my relationship with anything that is not basically, consumable, and how it helped me really detach, have a sense of detachment. And it's really helped me kind of get rid of things that I think you mentioned this in one of your videos, the sort of controversial 1 year rule, which I actually love and use a lot of, if I haven't touched this or thought about it or used this in a year, it's garbage. And that's it, But we've lived in this house for almost 12 years now, and we have an attic. The attic is like my albatross, because the attic has become purgatory. And so I don't have to throw things out. I just put them in the attic and not have to deal with them. And I'm seeing that pattern again, right? Which is somebody else will deal with this. And either that somebody else is going to be me someday, or it's going to be my kids. Anyway, I started rambling. I don't even remember what my question was. I think it was the our relationship to stuff, I think, can be really complex. And I know you deal with that with a lot of videos too. And I know Marie Kondo deals with that and she's been a very, very popular in the ADHD community as well, as a method of letting go. Do you think there's something specific about neurodivergence and our attachment to stuff? Are we more prone to that, you think? Do you have a theory about that? Of why is it memory related? Why do you think so many of us do kind of hold on to that might be useful someday, or I'm going to need that someday?
That's an interesting question. And in all honesty, I haven't given that any thought. But as you say that, it makes me think of a couple of things. So first of all, a lot of people keep so many things because of the fear of death. So you may have heard of Swedish death cleaning. And there's a few in the book, there are 3 sort of clutter instincts that are described sort of just in one section. And she talks about the fear of death and the hoarding instinct and the clutter instinct. So clutter, having stuff around us, makes it feel secure. If you think back to, the Stone Age, having stuff around us, that we'd be like, okay, good. I've got food, I've got hides, whatever. And it's the same with the hoarding. Now, the fear of death is very interesting because a lot of us keep things because time is slipping away. And it reminds us of our childhood, or it reminds us of when we were in our 20s and we were young and having fun, or when our kids were little. And as time goes on, and we don't need those things anymore, it's still really hard to let them go because we're still attached to what the meaning behind that thing is. So it's not really the thing. The object, honestly, is not important, in particular, if it honestly is not something you use. So I always say, does it add value to your life? If it gives, one lady who is in my community, she does not have the ability to remember things without looking at something or smelling it. Like she can't just think about a memory. So, for her, it's kind of interesting. I said, you almost have to choose what memories are worth keeping, right? Not every memory that we remember is worth keeping. Now, I think for people with ADHD and other neurodivergencies, I almost wonder if part of it is because growing up, so many people with ADHD struggled in a lot of ways. Socially, there were a lot of struggles. A lot of women in particular, there were expectations on us when we were young to be good, to be quiet, and that was hard for us in the classroom, or to be good students. In our 20s and 30s, learning, being a mom, all of that was a struggle for a lot of us because our brains don't work like everybody else's. And so I almost wonder if a lot of our belongings are a source of comfort, because during some of those hard times, we went to our, Nirvana CD collection and listened to things, even though now we have everything on MP3 and CDs aren't worth anything. Although maybe there are now, who knows? But that would be my guess. I honestly don't know. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great theory. I think it definitely hits home. I think for me, my theory was always, like you said, about memory, right? I will forget something. I will forget entire parts of my childhood. I don't have access to my past the way I think most people do. And so I get that emotional surge when I see something from my past, or, when I see something from my kid's childhood, right? There's so much emotion that comes with those things that it feels tragic, like you're throwing away the memory. Right. And I think that's why I feel like, how did we get to a point where we associate so much of that memory or so much of our life with that thing? But I think it's because we don't remember without them. And so I feel like it's almost like if we get rid of it, we'll never get that memory back. And that feels sad in theory.
Oh, yeah. Well, right? And one of the things, sorry to interrupt, one of the things that I think is really important when decluttering, in particular for people who aren't able to access those memories, is to honestly just keep a journal. If you are actively decluttering your house and you get a memory from something and you designate that this is not an item worth keeping, because Peter Walsh, who's back in the 90s, Oprah had him on her show. He's great. And he said, treasures, the most important things that we actually keep, we shouldn't have more than can fit on a dining room table. And I mean, some of us, we have decorations, which is great, but what is a true treasure, right? I'm not going to get rid of all of my decorations. I'm not that level of minimalist. But if I go, this particular item gives me a memory, but it's not actually worth keeping. I'm going to declutter it because by having it in my house, it's more stuff to manage and it's damaging to me in the long term. And it gives me a memory. I can write that memory down and write down as much as I can, journal a page or two. Perhaps that is helpful. So that is one piece of advice that I do give to people and that one person in my group as well. So, yeah, so sorry I interrupted there, but.
Well, I was just going to say, I often will have to ask myself the question of, if you keep this, then what happens, right? Because, I remember when I was going through my parents' stuff and I would come across things like, I came across my grandmother's wedding dress. And I just, I was like, oh my goodness, my grandmother's wedding dress, so fragile and wonderful, and I have to keep this. And then I had to have that whole conversation with myself, which was like, yeah, but if you keep this, then what? Like, what's going to really logically, what's going to happen? Like, it's a thing that you feel obligated to hold on to because it has all of the sentimental value. But I was sort of like, I had to talk myself out of every single item in that way of just like, then what? Because it will add to it. And I often, like sometimes I find that is healthier for me than necessarily than like, a lot of the advice that you get as a parent of young kids, which is like, rather than keep the artwork, take a picture. And then I'm like, but then what? Then I'm just like a digital hoarder. And I will admit I'm a digital hoarder. I put it out away. I forget about it. I don't want to think about it. And thankfully it hasn't, it hasn't affected me too much because, we're able to just buy larger hard drives, and I haven't really mastered that one. But I always remember thinking with that, at that crossroad, right, of like, well, why would I take pictures of it? Like, what, why not just get rid of it? Why not kind of live in the moment in my life more? And I think those were those big milestones where it was sort of like, I just want to enjoy the moment, right? And not sort of hold on to as much as possible. And I think maybe it has to do with the memory issue, right? Which is like, I'm just going to let go of everything in the hopes that it's not going to matter at the end of my life. That what's going to matter is sort of like how I felt. Right? It's like I always say with books, I can't tell you what a book was about that I read, but I will tell you if I liked it or not. Maybe I could like apply that to my whole life, right? Which is just like, I can't tell you anything that happened over the course of my life, but I will be able to know if I enjoyed myself or not. I don't know. I'm like just talking on the fly right now, but it is, I think, a really interesting idea. I think our relationship with clutter is so complicated and so nuanced. And I think, like you've said in some of your videos and in the email to me, like just how interwoven it is with our sense of shame and our sense of worth and who we are as a person, I think is so affected by our environment and the stuff around us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, but with the kids in the pictures, the reason we don't want to declutter that item or take the pictures, we don't want our kids to grow up. And at the same time we do, but in a lot of ways we don't. Like I have a kid who's probably going to university in a year, and every summer for me is kind of sad because that's when everybody's birthday is and school, but it just is like, that is just life, right? Like we have to accept that things are going to move on. And like you said, like I think I've got 25,000 photos that I need to, and I say to myself every Friday at 4:00, I'm going to do it. But that reminder on my phone, like, I'll be honest, as a person who does not like clutter, I ignore it. I probably shouldn't have it at 4:00 on Friday. Like, let's be honest, that is not a time where I want to declutter photos. But really, sometimes, if I'm making a video, sometimes I'll look through photos and then I come across photos of the kids, which is great. And I love them, but I never go, oh, look at that photo or of that picture that they drew back in grade 2. There's the odd one. Like my oldest, he painted a picture of a shark with one big eyebrow. Like, that's great. We love it. Like, we actually have the physical canvas. And if we were to declutter that, we would definitely take a picture because it's great. But how many like really good photo or pieces of artwork do kids bring home? Some kids are talented, and parents with a talented artistic kid, like, I feel for you because I'm glad mine did not have a lot of great things they were bringing home. So you're absolutely right. Like, should you be taking photos of absolutely everything? Because yes, there is digital clutter, and a lot of us, like, then we're managing our computers and we're managing our phones, and life is meant to be lived. It's not meant to be managed. We shouldn't be managing all of these little things of our lives. And when I talk about simplifying on my channel, more so, I'm trying to change it more to be about simplifying life overall. Because, and I remember, like, when I first started doing the decluttering, I was like, there is more to this, because a lot of it is in particular moms, like we overcommit in so many ways. We take on so much in our own lives. We take, like I would love some chickens and ducks, but I want my husband to want chickens and ducks because I want him to take care of them because I don't have the time. And so the reason I'm not getting chickens and ducks is because
I relate so hard to that.
And I'm not getting chickens and ducks because I will be the one taking care of them because he's not interested. And I mean, like, I'm not going to take on livestock so he can take care of it, if he doesn't want to. And so that's like a choice I have to make. And, and it's the same with activities, like kid activities. There's, Ali Kazaza, she says like with her kids, like sometimes she doesn't, there'll be full seasons of softball they'll skip for their kids because it just doesn't fit into what's going on with the family. And that's okay. Like a lot of times I live in Canada where hockey's a big thing, and a lot of people, it's like the thing, and they don't want to skip like a hockey season for their kids like that. God bless my kids. They all have developmental coordination disorder as well. So they're not coordinated enough to do hockey. And I consider myself blessed in that regard, but, I have it too. And I'm sure my brother does, although he's in denial about it. But really it just comes down to what are we willing to keep in our lives and take out so that we can spend more time with our family and more time enjoying life. I have decided I am living life the way I am now for the rest of my life. Like a lot of us, we think about what we want to do in our retirement, how we plan on living our life. I'm going to live like that now. And that involves not having a lot of extra things. And in the meantime, I can enjoy spending time with my kids. I'm not frustrated by their presence because I've got so much going on. And I'm not saying, anybody because that was me before. I was just like, like these, there's all this stuff to go on, and I've got this and I've got this and I've got this to do. And by removing things as much as possible, life has simplified so much easier. And it has made, the maybe 4.5 of us in the house who, have ADHD, that are diagnosed. I mean, I'm the one who hasn't officially, but it has made our lives way better overall. So I just say to people, remove whatever you can in every area possible. That's my rant.
No. It's such a good point to make that connection between like physical clutter and just clutter in our schedules, right? And clutter in our minds. And, yes. So many of us have that feeling of like, oh God, we use all the metaphors of the tornadoes and the bees and all, just always feeling like there's so much happening. And a huge part of my diagnosis was realizing that how much I overcommit, right? And how I said yes to everything because I was excitable and I was impulsive and I was a chronic volunteer and I was the PTA president and I would raise my hand and say yes to one thing and next thing I knew I had taken on the whole project and I was in charge and oh my God, I had nothing, like it just things would snowball. And I realized that how much I needed, like the answer was almost always to do less. And yes. I've taken that motto to so many parts of my life in terms of like, socializing and keeping my inner circle really small and saying no a lot more than I say yes for the sake of my own mental health. And I don't volunteer anymore. And there is a part of me that's like, I used to be the PTA president of my children's elementary school. And so when my son moved up to the middle school, the vice principal came up to me in the parking lot and he was like, hey, can we count on you? And I was like, nope. I was like, I will write a check. I don't care. Whatever you need. I'm not volunteering. And I feel ambivalent about that. I feel like, oh, what a terrible person that I'm not giving back to my community, et cetera. But I know how this ends. And so like for the sake of my own mental health, I've had to really, really step back and really like guard myself, right? And guard like my own soul environment, if you will, in terms of just who, friends and socializing and saying yes to family and all of those things that add up so quickly. It's like I'm in a constant state of paring down with everything, not only just the clutter itself, but just it helps me so much in terms of my happiness and my family and my mental health. And it's funny because I look back sometimes at like life before my diagnosis and I was like, I was doing all this stuff, and why don't I want to do that anymore? What's wrong with me that I don't, that I'm not all the time going out with friends or, or saying yes to these projects or going out to the movies all the time. And I'm like, things weren't okay then. Like, I thought they were okay, but they weren't. And this is what led to my diagnosis and led to all of this and this like implosion I had, because I was, that's sort of masking, right? That's part and parcel of the masking, which is like, I was doing all this stuff because I thought I should, or I thought that's what you do. And I realized that that was actually not healthy for me. And that like this smallness, this, really tight circle, all of this is what is, best for my mental health. And so it's been really interesting to think about that, to see how, I guess, make that connection between minimalism in all aspects, right? That it's not just having fewer things on your dresser, that it's really about manageability, right? And not, how recognizing how quickly we get overwhelmed and guarding that and having those boundaries, I think, is so important.
Absolutely.
But I will say the caveat is that my kids are older, and I don't know if I would have been able to have that whole spiel if I had toddlers.
Oh my gosh. Actually, it's funny because if I were to look back, if my kids were toddlers, kids can get along with very little stuff. And it's us parents who bring so much in. And my husband's love language is gift giving. And he just wanted to give them so much at Christmas and at birthdays. Meanwhile, and I was not as on board with that. And then it just became so much stuff to manage. So I don't know. I feel like little kids don't even need that much. And we can, because their existence is chaos. So having as little around as possible is, I think, so much better. But, I volunteer with fostering kittens in the summer. So we foster kittens from about May to October. They'd love for us to foster kittens and cats all year, but I have said, no, we don't between October and May. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. I kind of wish there weren't kittens in my bathroom right now. As great as they are, there is extra mess. I do have the kids doing the majority of the work, which is, the great thing about teenagers, although there is like the management of the kids doing the stuff. But then there's kittens in my bathroom. It's birthday season. So if we have people over, there's that issue. But, I want to help. I want to volunteer. That's the only way right now that I'm volunteering. But I put my foot down. I said, we are not doing it from October on, because I'm a busy mom. I'm an entrepreneur. Occasionally I work as a nurse, and I realize, like, a lot of us, we take on so much, not recognizing that, in particular when we're women with ADHD, even if they don't have a neurodivergency, it's a busy time. And to not recognize that is just doing a disservice for ourselves. And so we need to keep life as simple as possible. And a huge part of it is so we can remember it, right? Like, we spend so much time taking photos, but if life's busy, it's hard to remember things. So simplifying life, to me, overall, is it's such a game changer. And the other thing is, like, so many women with ADHD and, the other neurodivergencies, they're walking around feeling bad about themselves overall. They're in jobs at times where they're not thriving. They're feeling like the person who's always behind the eight ball. They're trying to, do things well, and they're wanting to sort of like make some kind of change, but they're completely overwhelmed anyway. And so they can't even like look at other options in life, or they can't even, manage to take on a hobby because they're struggling to do all of these things. Meanwhile, if they were to remove things, slow life down a little bit, then they actually have a little bit of time to evaluate what they're enjoying in life and maybe not feel so behind the eight ball. Removing things really helps with that.
Yeah, and you have so many wonderful videos on your YouTube channel too about kind of where to start with a lot, when you're feeling overwhelmed by all of that, by life. But what would you say is kind of one habit to start with for somebody? What's one habit that a listener could implement if they have ADHD and they're just feeling like, looking around at their house, just being like, I don't even know where to start?
I would honestly say start in the area that bothers you the most. And if that's your guest room filled to the ceiling with things, maybe consider a different area. Consider a spot where you spend a lot of time or that you walk by all the time that it bothers you the most. So maybe it is your kitchen or your living room. A dining room is a big thing. A lot of women have craft rooms that are like out of this world. But when you declutter that area, you can walk by it and feel like, oh my gosh, like, look how great that looks. Like if you're like me and you do something, you want to like go back several times a day and be like, look at that. Like I did that. That looks so good. So I think that's a great idea. So if it's your kitchen, the kitchen's a big job usually because there's a lot of stuff crammed in there overall. But if you can, or your bedroom, like, so you have one spot that is really clean. And the advice I would give to once you've chosen that spot is to just spend 15 to 30 minutes a day there. Use your phone as a timer to, number one, remind you to do the decluttering because reminders are our best friends, and to tell you when to stop. Sometimes people get really on a roll and they just want to spend like 6 hours doing it. I tend to try to tell people to do it more like a little bit every day, because if you do like 6 hours, you might be exhausted and put off of the whole thing. I mean, you decide what works for you. If it becomes an hour or two and you're loving it, go for it. But for me, I like to just set a timer, put on an audiobook or a podcast, and just enjoy it. Just enjoy the process. Decide what's serving you. Have a pile for what needs to go to recycling, what needs to go to garbage, and what needs to be donated. And accept the fact that, yes, some things need to be thrown away, because whether or not you keep it all of your life, it will go in the garbage eventually. So why not let it go in the garbage now?
Yes, that is something that I think about a lot too, which is like, if I hold on to this, who's going to have to deal with this and when? And how much will my children be angry at me when someday they have to deal with this? Yeah. But even still, like, even just, it is really hard with kids, with young kids, in terms of, just thinking about like scissors and tape and those things that just sort of always, every time I turn around, they're gone. And so I go, then I'm at Target and I buy 12 of them so that I can have more because I know they're going to go. And it's just like this never ending cycle. Yeah. Now when you were talking about bigger projects, that's another thing I think a lot of us tend to struggle with is loss of momentum, and just like kind of getting halfway through a project and losing the dopamine and getting overwhelmed. And, like I'll do what I like to call rage cleaning, which is, I'm fighting with somebody in my house is a great incentive for me to like start really tackling the big projects. And, but, I'll get to the point where I'm like, oh, okay, I feel better now. I've done this one spot and then I've lost momentum to do anything else. Do you have any tips for like getting over, that barrier, that wall of lost momentum?
Yeah, there are a couple of things you can try, and it all kind of depends on the person. But the first thing is, it's great if you can just make it a daily habit. Now, I know people with ADHD, boredom is just like absolute torture. So if you can at all make it enjoyable, like I said, put on a podcast or an audiobook, like splurge for the Audible subscription and just get a book. And so making it a habit, fighting that resistance and doing it every day. I know the momentum is hard, but once you get started, even just say to yourself, okay, if I just do 5 minutes, that's one thing you can do. I also am a huge fan of rewards. I love to reward myself. I reward myself with tea all the day, and occasionally I will reward myself with other things. And I also really like the idea of writing down what it is, why you're doing this in the first place. So if you say to yourself, you know, I hate how messy my kitchen is all of the time. I have nowhere to put anything. And if you just say, I have a vision of a clean kitchen where everything has a space, I can open a drawer, it's not crammed full, and you can just say that to yourself to just keep yourself motivated. And you have to find what works for you. Sometimes it is a real struggle for people to keep motivated, but overall, I mean, I'm your kind of tough love coach where accountability is my favorite thing. I mean, that's one thing. If you want, you can hire a coach if you need somebody to help you stay motivated and accountable, or a friend. Please check in on me when I get this done. We're going to go for lunch. Some people, they've actually had people who is like a friend who's not mean, but is a friend that will hold them accountable and somehow punish them, like make them write a check and give it to a charity or some organization that they absolutely despise. I think that's a really funny one. I'm not sure if I would.
I always say invite your really judgmental friend to come over in a few days.
There you go.
Nothing motivates you to clean your living room like knowing a super judgmental person's coming over.
It's so true. Yeah, like for us, that's what works, is if somebody's coming over.
I know, right? Yeah, I think, yeah. And then all of a sudden with lockdown, we realized how many of us were using other people as our motivation to clean our house. No, it's so true about finding your why. And I think that's something that's really difficult to hold on to. Like the other, recently my husband and my son went away for a few days and my daughter and I were home together and I was just like, he's the kind of person who he is so type A and he will not go to bed until the sink is clean and the counter's done and like all of that stuff. And so when he was gone, I was, the first night I was like, oh, finally, like I'm in charge. I'm going to leave these dishes. I'm going to deal with them in the morning. It's going to be on my own time. I'm not going to feel pressure to clean up. And I woke up the next morning and there were fruit flies all over the sink. And I was like, oh, right. This is why we do the dishes at night. But it was great because it was like, even though I had to live with a fruit fly, like I just was like, oh, okay, this is my why. I don't want to deal with fruit flies. So now I will remember and hold on to that every night when the child, and I talk about this with my clients too, like acknowledge the child and the adult that kind of cohabitate in your brain, right? So like acknowledge that there is that part of you that's like, I don't want to do this. It's boring. It's mundane or whatever it is. Like, yeah, why would you want to do that? That's okay. But then at the same time, like you said, there's that other voice, the adult who comes in, who's like, okay, but it has to get done. Yeah. So what are we going to do to get it done? When does it need to get done? What's going to happen if it doesn't get done? And like ask, how sort of go through that list of questions where it's like, we got to do this. So how are we going to figure out how to do this? And what is our why? And I think that's so important to like have those very conscious conversations in your head. So for me, that's how I do it. I act out the conversation between the child and the adult. And I like parent myself, and I think in a way that it can be really helpful. And then, every once in a while I get fruit flies and I learn my lesson. I wanted to go back to something about momentum. Nope, sorry, I lost it. Was there anything else? I feel like I kind of interjected, so I don't know if there was anything about finding your why and
well, one thing I think that also people need to remember is you have to make your decisions, right? Like a lot of people can be like, well, I don't feel like it and I lose momentum, and it's like, okay, well, do you or don't you want to live with clutter? Right. And I know people hate that, but it is that tough love. And that's the decision. You have to decide. And if you do write down your a vision for that space and your vision for your life. Like, why not only it's nice to have the kitchen clean, but why do we want the kitchen clean? It makes it easier. We spend less time. It's easier to cook. It's easier to clean. It's easier to then move on with the rest of the day. It's easier to go to, spend the day out and come in and bring home pizza and then put it all away, right? Like, you have to decide, like, what is your ultimate goal? Like, what is the reason for doing these things? So I feel like that sometimes people just need to really have a hard conversation with themselves, like you say, and be like, what is the adult and the child? What's the conversation look like? Like with my son, with getting up early in the morning. Okay. And become an entrepreneur and be rich and start your day at 12 if you want to, but that's not your life right now. So decide.
Well, and I think also with ADHD, and realizing and having that same conversation that I talk to myself a lot with, I talk about with myself a lot, but also with my kids, which is like, yeah, ADHD is an explanation. It's a why you're having difficulty, but it's not an excuse. And, we hear that a lot. So it's like, yeah, of course, that's fascinating. And now you know why, so you don't have to feel bad about yourself and you don't have to feel shame around why this is a problem for you or why you struggle with this in this particular area. So that's really fascinating, but still needs to get done.
That's just it, right? And I made a video about that, and I said, is ADHD an excuse? Because occasionally, people will say that, and they'll be like, oh, it's just for pharmaceutical, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no.
Occasionally, I feel like it's all the time people say
yeah. See, and that's just it. Like, for me, I'm just like, la, 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 blinders up. But it's true. And so I just wanted to, I tackle that subject head on and be like, it's a reason. It's not an excuse. And so that's why it's like this. But like you say, it sucks. Like, yes, sometimes there are extra steps, but a person, that is what it's like having an impairment of some sorts. People who have visual impairments, they have accommodations they have to make. People who are paraplegics with wheelchairs, they have accommodations they have to make. And yeah, sometimes it takes way longer. I mean, I've had patients who, just to get them up to the toilet, it takes, 10 minutes on a lift, right? So everybody in this life, there are some good things and some bad things. And we need to just be like, okay, this is not ideal. And unfortunately, when it comes to executive function and motivation, people with ADHD have a bit of an impairment, which definitely sucks. But I think getting to know yourself and knowing what works for you, and if you have to, just like come down to Mel Robbins' 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and just like get up and do it, right?
Yeah, I know, right? I think so much of it has to do with like, just go easy on yourself and realize that this is something you struggle with, and that's totally okay. And I think why people like Casey Davis and Domestic Blisters has been so profound, has had such a profound effect on my life too, which was really just like, this is morally neutral. All of this is morally neutral, but it's got to get done. So
right. Yeah.
So now, segueing from this idea of, ADHD is, it's a conversation I talk a lot about this podcast. It's not a superpower by any means. There's so many wonderful aspects about it. Is it a disorder? Is it not a disorder? Would you rename it something? Did you think about that? Would you call it something else if you could?
It's funny because I was talking to my husband about this, and he's, of course, trying to come up with all these like ways to use the acronym ADHD. And I'm like, And so for me, I thought, because in one of my videos, I can't even remember exactly what I said, but I thought it would be great to call it Creative Procrastinatosaurus. Because so many people, not everybody, him is one of them, him is one, but is not that creative. But so many people with ADHD are creative in some ways. And I mean, like, his brain is amazing in a lot of ways, where people with ADHD, they can hyperfocus, they can be creative. There are so many wonderful things. And it just, but yet there is that procrastination part, which is like I'm paralyzed, I don't know what to do now. And so that's what I came up with, Creative Procrastinatosaurus.
I love that. And I love the Asaurus part. Well, I have a very different view of procrastination than most, I think. I actually think of procrastination as being a very important tool that we can use in terms of, manufactured urgency, as Tamara Rosia called it. And it reminds me of when I was a kid. I think I've shared this on the podcast before, but when I was a kid and I had to clean my room, I had this very clever way of doing it where I pretended that my room was my apartment and that I was an adult and that my parents had called me from the airport. And, and they would call me from the airport and they'd be like, "Hey, Addie, surprise, we're coming to visit you. We're going to be there in 15 minutes. And I'd be like, "Okay," in my little 8-year-old voice, my imaginary phone. I'd be like, "Okay, can't wait to see you." And then I'd hang up my imaginary phone and go, "Oh no, my parents are going to be here in 15 minutes. And and then I would race around my room and try to clean it as fast as possible. And so now it's like, was really interesting to me to think about that memory through the lens of ADHD now as an adult, being like, wow, what a clever way to create urgency, right? And we do that with timers. We do that with so many ways in which we use procrastination to our advantage to make things, we sort of gamify in a lot of ways. So, right. I think there's so many ways in which we can like really lean into our procrastination and our need for urgency, but that's a whole other podcast. Maybe I'll have you, we can talk about that another time. Because I don't think of procrastination. I feel like we have a lot of charge and baggage around procrastination, and we think of it as this really terrible thing. But I actually think there's a lot of ways in which it can be used to our advantage. But anyway, I really love your videos, and I think I love your style, and I love your kind of the gentle. What did you call it? Like you called it, you said something yourself, you're not a drill sergeant, but just sort of like there was like a gentle firmness about about the way you talk about this very, very nuanced, complicated topic for so many of us. And so, I really recommend your channel to our listeners. I'll have it in the show notes. But where can people find you if they want to work with you? Do you work with people all over? Because I know you're in Vancouver Island, but do you work with clients? Basically anyone, right? I mean, we're all virtual these days.
I do. Most of my clients are in the US. I did get up, there was a bit of a time change problem. And so, chatted with a lady from London the other day. I had a very early start to my day, but it was very, very productive. So that was good. I am currently, my channel is called Minimalist Home. I am probably changing it to my name, Robin Buchanan, but for now it is Minimalist Home. And my website is minimalisthome.ca. And you can also find me on my Instagram at Minimalist Home, please.
Wonderful. I'm so glad you reached out to me. I loved it. I've actually had quite a few people reach out to me and asking me if we had a podcast episode on decluttering. And I've had a few conversations about like productivity and organization, but this is actually the first time we really kind of delved into clutter and decluttering. So I really appreciate finding you and thank you so much for sitting down with me and sharing your personal story and some great practical tips.
It was an absolute pleasure, Katie. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.